Welcome back to our MOOC on comparative regional integration. In the first video we had a look at why you should study comparative regional integration. In this video we'll have a look at an equally vital question being, what is regional integration? What are we actually studying? Of course it's quite important to define what you're actually doing in addition to knowing why you want to study it. Now, if we look at the concept of regional integration, we can separate it into two issues, namely what is integration and what is regional. At this point you may be incredibly impressed by this high standard of academic ingeniousness. You can see that I've studied this phenomenon for years, or as they summarize it in English sometimes, no shit Sherlock. So it's pretty basic, but still important to do your groundwork to lay the foundations. So let's have a look at these two core concepts of integration and regional, what we mean with them, and also what the difficulties are in actually using them. Some conceptual tools to help us think about regional integration. What does regional integration mean? And the useful tools I want to hand to you in order to also think about this in a more substantiated, structured manner are regionalisation versus regionalism, and regional integration as a concept, as it also relates to the concepts of supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. So let's have a look at those concepts, and they can then help us to structure the different types of organizations we have, the different phenomena we will study. So, regionalisation versus regionalism. Regionalisation is actually the broader overarching term, right? It's the broadest concept in our toolkit. Regionalisation means, if I follow the definition here from Bersel and Risse, a process of increasing economic, political, social or cultural interactions among geographically or culturally contiguous states and societies. As you may have noticed, this is quite broad. So this actually covers all kinds of collaboration, interaction between different states, even if it's very informal. Think, for example, about cultural collaboration or ethnic minorities that are spread over different countries and that come together in the tribal context or not, or different forms of economic intertwinement, even without any involvement of the state. So regionalisation covers both formal collaboration, but also informal collaboration from actors in civil society, individuals, companies, NGOs, etc. Right? And that is the strength of the concept of regionalisation. It helps you to look at the region and look at all the different ways in which entities actually collaborate within a region. Of course, as always, strength is at the same time a weakness. Because of its breadth, the concept of regionalisation also covers so many different behaviors, phenomena, that it may be difficult to study them or bring them together or understand them all. Now, regionalisation can be contrasted with regionalism. And regionalism, which is narrower, focuses on collaboration between states. So regionalism, if we again follow Bersel and Risse's definition, constitutes a primarily state-led process of building and sustaining formal regional institutions and organizations among at least 3 states. Because if it's only 2, it's bilateral, right? So this is of course more of a logical focus for this MOOC, because usually these formal types of integration relate more to law, to norms, to institutions. At the same time, if you only focus on regionalism, state-led exercises, you of course risk missing important social forms of collaboration that may be very important in different regions. So, if you focus on regionalism, you gain focus, your examples become more limited and clearer, but you might also lose track of what goes on the ground in these different regions. Now, I realized that I'm making a classic academic mistake of starting with the boring stuff, the definitions. We could have started with some juicy examples of regional organizations, but I'm sorry, this is an academic course and I think it's really important to cover these concepts before we go to the actual organizations. Now, regionalism therefore also leads more to the established regional organizations that you may be familiar with, like the EU, Mercosur, ECOWAS, ASEAN, etc. These are all examples of regionalism. Another distinction lies between regional cooperation versus regional integration. And again, we have here a broader term and a narrower term, right? And the distinction refers to the level and kind of authority you transfer to a regional organization. Simply put, if you create an organization, you have 10 countries and you say, let's create an organization, how much power will you give it? And will that organization have the power to decide on your behalf, even if you disagree? So how much power do you give to the central level? Now, regional cooperation, as the name suggests, is the broader term. It covers, again, if we follow the definition by Bersel and Risse, primarily intergovernmental relations that do not entail the transfer of authority to the respective regional organization. We'll have a closer look at the concept of intergovernmental in a moment, but in essence this means that the states remain the primary sovereign actors, they retain final control, but they collaborate and they can make agreements, right? And of course, the benefit of having such a more intergovernmental approach is that the states retain more power. They don't have to transfer their power. You can guess the downside, it tends to make these organizations less effective because they cannot decide and they cannot enforce what they decide as easily as other organizations. Now, regional integration is then the more narrow concept, and regional integration actually implies the transfer of at least some authority and sovereignty rights to the regional level. So as countries, you come together and you say, okay, let's make this work. The only way we'll ever pick a restaurant with more than 20 people if we simply say to one of us, okay, you pick, right? Let's transfer some authority to the region to decide. So what should be the environmental norm? Who should check whether countries actually respect the CO2 emission norms? Let's create an independent authority who can check that. That is really integration, transferring sovereignty rights. Now, this closely relates to the concept of supranationalism that we will discuss in the next slide. And the main example of regional integration is actually the EU. The EU is by far the most integrated system that we have in the world. So we'll have a closer look at that later in this MOOC. Be careful, however. The definition very carefully says that we're talking here about sovereignty rights. So you delegate the power to exercise some of your sovereignty rights. Think about the EU, where we have the euro, right? The only one who is allowed to set the interest rates and to print money is the European Central Bank. So member states have delegated their sovereignty right over monetary control to the EU. They have not delegated their sovereignty, I would argue, because a sovereign can delegate some sovereignty rights. But I have to stop myself here because I can talk for hours about this topic. We'll get back to the issue of sovereignty when we come to specific challenges. But notice that integration actually entails giving some authority to the central level. Now that links to the often used terms supranational versus intergovernmental, something you will come across when you read about the EU or any other regional organization. Now, the concepts relate again to the formal hierarchy between the regional level and the states and the type and kind of power you delegate. It also refers to who gets to decide. If a decision has to be taken, will it be taken by the member states, by an independent regional body, by a mix? And what is the effect of a rule? If ASEAN or Mercosur decides something, are you bound? What happens if you don't listen? Those types of questions all affect supranational versus intergovernmental nature of an organization. Now, in a supranational organization, as the name already suggests, the regional organization is in some ways above the states, supranational. And that means that the regional organization can control, bind, limit, decide in some way. So some examples when we talk about supranationalism, for example, when the regional organization can make decisions against the will of some of its members. Remember, the main rule in public international law is that sovereign states cannot be bound against their will. If you don't want to join a treaty, you don't join the treaty. In the EU, for example, many decisions are taken by qualified majority in the Council. So all the states vote, and if a qualified majority of states agree, then the rule is adopted and everyone is bound, even states that voted against. Well, this is a clear example of supranationalism, being bound against your will by something that the region decides. Also, an example of supranationalism is that the norms of the region trump the norms of the state. So if the region decides something, member states have to comply. They have a legal obligation to comply. And the third crucial example is the creation of independent bodies. So bodies that do not represent the member states or that are not composed of national politicians or national civil servants, but that directly represent the region as such. Think about the European Commission. So supranationalism entails transferring these rights, these powers to the region and putting the region above the member states. Intergovernmentalism, on the other hand, the power remains with the states. So the states collaborate, but usually they cannot be bound against their will. So unanimity will be the norm, which means that if not everyone is on board, there is no deal. Also, national laws will trump regional norms unless they happen to have a dualist system, something we will discuss, a monist system, something we will discuss later on in more detail. And member states tend to control all decision making at any serious level at the regional level. So if decisions are made, this is usually done by ministers coming together or high civil servants coming together or the heads of state coming together and deciding on behalf of the organization, not by something like an independent commission or an independent court that can interpret regional rules. Now, intergovernmentalism leaves more space to the member states, but is of course less effective in some ways than supranational. Okay, so we have some of our concepts. We can study regionalisation in a very broad manner. We can focus on regionalism. Within regionalism, we can have more supranational and more intergovernmental approaches. We already have some basic constructs to start to think about different organizations. And as a real academic, my job now is that we have created some clarity to destroy that clarity. Because everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler as it is in reality. Now, these concepts help you think structured about a regional organization. But of course, in reality, these forms blend. Even the EU is a mix of supranationalism and intergovernmentalism. Some powers are more with the states, some areas like foreign relations are more intergovernmental in nature, other areas are hardcore supranational, like customs law or EMU, but there's always a bit of a blend. And more importantly, also when you study different regions, is that hierarchy is not as simple as fixed as treaties or laws might suggest. There can be formal and informal types of hierarchy that, for example, make some norms, even though they are formally intergovernmental, very binding. There can of course also be other factors that make something binding. If you are in a regional organization and you are a very small state, say that you are Laos, and Indonesia and Singapore agree on something, well, there will be some political pressure to maybe go along. ASEAN might not be the best example because they go to great lengths to respect each other's sovereignty and independence, but you get the picture, right? If a bigger country has factual power, then that factual power will also impact how the regional organization works. Because the moment you create a regional organization, reality doesn't stop applying. You are still in the same power relationships, geographical relationships, economic relationships that you were before. Now, because intergovernmentalism and supranationalism are more fluid, it's also important to realize that you can choose the right mix for your region. You don't have to say it will be completely supranational or completely intergovernmental. Maybe you can start with limited supranationalism on one area. To give you an example, in the Andean community, the Andean system works particularly well for IP rights for several reasons. Well, fine. You can start in a more narrow area and have effective collaboration there. You don't always have to use the EU model where you go for very broad supranationalism on many themes, right? So these concepts allow you to think about regional organizations. They also allow you to think about how to organize them and which blend, because reality is always, of course, this nice gray zone between the absolute abstract norms. So how to organize it for your region? And that leads us to the second question, what is your region anyway? When we talk about a region, what do we mean? For example, let's take Asia. What is Asia? Where does Asia begin? Where does it end? Who's part of Asia? Who gets to decide whether you're part of Asia or not? And does it always remain the same? Could Asia be something different 20 years from now than it is now? How does that work? So it sounds pretty easy and simple, a region, and we all work with a couple of regions implicitly in our minds, but actually sitting down and defining and justifying what a region is quite complex. And that also leads to another important question, which is crucial also from a methodological point of view and also from a decentering point of view. Who gets to decide what a region is? Because Asia, for a certain part, was actually created, in Europe at least, by Romans, who saw the rest, other parts, as Asia. So who gets to define what a region is and what your region is? Which of course can also lead to historical colonial problems. What if someone else decided you were a region some time ago and the notion stuck, but maybe you don't want to be? So, who gets to decide this? I decided to go for a rabbit instead of a cat for this picture because apparently they're also very popular. Well, a couple of key challenges and problems here. First, do you always define a region according to statal limits? Remember the distinction between regionalism and regionalisation? Well, if you stick with statal limits, of course it makes your life easier because you have maps with boundaries on it. But those boundaries also encapsulate all kinds of historical choices. Maybe they were not drawn voluntarily, maybe they're contested. So by sticking to boundaries and states, note that you also base yourself on some normative assumptions, historical facts that you may not want to be bound to. Are the boundaries in Africa, for example, many of which were drawn by colonial powers, the right place to start? Or should you use regionalism to escape those boundaries? All of those questions come into play when you define a region. And are they the same for everyone? Are there objective regions, or is a region something subjective? Can you say, I self-identify as European, and someone else says, well, I don't, and we don't belong to the same region? How does that work? Cultural and historical lines, of course, deeply affect our thinking, but our definitions of regions also shape how we think. So there's, again, important questions to be asked, critical questions when you design a region. And as I said, are they static or fluid over time? Does it change? Does it alter? Can a region disappear or not? One of the more analytically complex and challenging ones I find is whether a region should always be geographically contiguous, and also should it even be geographically defined. Historically, it made sense to look at countries next to each other. For example, trade was largely in goods, so you had to bring your stuff from country A to country B, was useful if you were next to each other. However, in our current digital age, geography is less relevant. If you can send messages, if you can send digital services with the speed of light to each other, geography disappears. So should we stop seeing geography as a limiting factor, as an organizing factor for how we see the world? Can we actually create digital regions where different countries or even different parts of countries or different individuals form regions in a digital sense without belonging to a geographic location? But if we do that, how do those digital regions interact with physical regions? Because no matter how much your life has now gone online, you will still be physically in a country that will decide certain things about you. So how do the digital and the real worlds interact also in terms of regionalism? Many practical questions, but also some pretty fundamental analytical, academic, conceptual questions here. Another challenge then is if you have regions, well, many regions overlap. Who gets to decide what, if you have multiple regions and they overlap, how do they interact? And can you be part of multiple regions? Or sometimes do you have to choose, and how do you choose? So these types of challenges make it a bit harder to define the region, and it gets even more complex if we do not just look at general organizations, but we also look at organizations that have a specific function. Think about a regional organization focused solely on human rights, or on trade, or maybe focusing on medical collaboration, or just organizing the way that the rivers are managed. If you also have regional organizations that are functionally limited to a specific area, you can have even more overlap. So defining the region and the area is a core step in regional integration and something you need to think critically about. Well, for this MOOC, how do we deal with all these complexities and choices and concepts? Well, we focus on sufficiently formalized regions. So we focus on regionalism and not regionalization as such. We try to take on board insights from broader regionalization studies, but the focus is on formalized regions and therefore also state-led regions. We also focus on areas that are more or less geographically contiguous because this is where most of the formalized entities and regions are. That means that we stick to those statal lines, but as said before, we're very aware of the normative assumptions, challenges, and possible risks this entails, and so should you. Now, the reason we do this is in part because law and binding norms require some formalization. Regionalization will usually have less formal law or norms or institutions to study. So for us, formalism allows us to study, identify what we study, and study those elements in more detail. And at the same time, defining the regions, even within these choices, is part of the challenge and the fun. Now, quite often, we will simply follow formal organizations in this MOOC. So we will talk about existing organizations like ASEAN and Mercosur and the Andean Community, and those are simply delineated by the membership. But that doesn't mean that we uncritically accept notions of region, but just that we focus on specific organizations when we discuss them. So let's have a look at some of those examples I just mentioned, right? So ASEAN, for example, what is it and where is it? ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, currently has 10 states. So the ASEAN region, as defined by ASEAN itself, is the territory of these 10 states, being Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. As you will see, they differ quite a lot on almost any relevant aspect. And these countries try to collaborate in ASEAN, which is known as one of the most intergovernmental regional organizations out there. Another example we'll be looking at is regional integration in Africa. And I mentioned the challenge of overlap. Well, here you see it illustrated. Africa has 8 regional economic integration systems. These are actually overlapping, so many countries are a member of more than one regional system. And then overarching that, we also have the system of the African Union, and we also have the African Continental Free Trade Area, so we have a jolly overlap, not to mention WTO and other more international systems. Within Africa, one of those regional organizations is the East African Community, which currently consists of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Uganda and Tanzania, with Somalia in close proximity to membership. One of the 8 regions in Africa and one of the more supranational ones that we will be studying in this MOOC. In Latin America, when you look at the region, of course, there's quite a few countries, also big differences in size, in history. A big question in Latin America, however, is if you look at Latin American integration like this, or you look at it like this, taking into account the relationship between the southern part and the northern part, including also, of course, the United States. One of the interesting things about Latin America is that they have many organizations. In fact, creating regional organizations seems to be something of a regional hobby, which leads to the question, how do all of these systems function? Do they actually live? Are they maybe deceased by now? And how do they interact? One of the major ones, which we'll be focusing on in this course, is Mercosur, the Mercado Común del Sur, apologies for my Spanish, which currently consists as formal state parties of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay and Venezuela, that has been suspended for a while now for multiple issues, most importantly democratic backsliding. Now there's a couple of associate states as well, but these states form the common market of the South together. And then of course a key example, the European Union. The EU currently consisting of 27 member states. After Brexit, we had 28 and then went down to 27, but started actually with 6 member states. So expanded significantly over the course of the history, and there's actually quite a few countries that still want to join. So there's multiple states waiting in line to join, and some people talking about expanding even to maybe 35 member states in the EU. Some people saying that that should absolutely not happen. And the EU, as I said, is a core example of integration, but not the gold standard by any means. And those are just a couple of the ones that we will be discovering. Just full disclosure, this picture is definitely not me, but I just wanted to purvey a certain sense of adventure and openness as we go in the rest of this MOOC. So for now, thanks very much and see you in the next video or somewhere on our shared globe in the near future, talking about regional integration. Thank you very much.